Donald Trump's approval ratings are lower than ever. Viktor Orban just suffered a landslide defeat. Most Brits now think Brexit was a massive mistake, and most Europeans trust EU bureaucrats more than their own elected governments. So it kinda looks like right-wing populism is collapsing, right? It seems that people are finally realizing that random tariff barrages won't fix the American economy and that populists may promise to drain the swamp, but they really mean replace the swamp, and that leaving the EU did not result in more money for healthcare. The populist surge in the West is over. This is the end. Or is it? Actually, the experience of early adopter populist countries shows us that this is extremely unlikely. For example, in Austria, populism collapsed in the early 2000s after Jörg Haider's Freedom Party government turned out to be a chaotic mess. But once again, although not in power, the Austrian Freedom Party got the most votes in the last election. Similarly, in Italy, the populist Berlusconi faced a crushing defeat after it became clear his billionaire who will rescue the economy narrative was not working. Yet Berlusconi always came back, and even when he himself did not, Italy is now again ruled by a populist right-wing president. In fact, looking at these graphs, we can see that the dynamic is often the same. Once right-wing populism emerges, yes, it often suffers crushing setbacks due to chaotic infighting, no economic progress, and the exposure of massive corruption. But it never really goes away. So, right-wing populists may suffer crushing defeats and often embarrassing ones, but eventually they always bounce back. Which raises the question, why does populism always keep bouncing back? Why is it not going away after all of those broken promises? As always, on Money Macro, we've immersed ourselves into the relevant scientific literature and selected the 4 most prevalent explanations. Narrative number 1. It's the economy, stupid. Ordinary people have been left behind. Narrative number 2. Right-wing populists have a point. Mainstream politicians themselves are the problem. They've become out of touch on cultural issues like immigration. Narrative number 3. People have just become more racist/authoritarian. And last but not least, narrative number 4. It's actually social media that's to blame, that is pushing people to political extremes. In this video, we examine the evidence and counter-evidence for each theory to determine which of them has the most convincing explanation for why right-wing populism keeps bouncing back. But before solving the puzzle, we first need to make sure we are all talking about the same thing. That is, what is right-wing populism actually? And how is it different from left-wing populism? Aren't these polar opposites? Why are we talking about them in the same breath? Well, yes and no. This is something people often get wrong. Populism is not at all like socialism or like conservatism. It's not an ideology. It's a way of talking about politics, a lens through which political conflict is framed. At its core, both left and right-wing populism divides society into 2 opposing groups. On the one hand, the hard-working people, and on the other, the corrupt elites. Populism is pretty easy to understand. Essentially, all problems in society are the fault of these corrupt elites. The difference between left and right-wing populism then is which elite group they frame as the problem. On the left, populists target economic elites, such as
rich and the corporations.
The proletariat of tremendous wealth.
A government of the billionaire class, by the billionaire class.
On the other hand, right-wing populists target a different kind of elite group, the cultural elites, such as
a brüsszeli bürokraták, az amerikai demokraták és a soros hálózat.
But also academics or mainstream politicians accused of ignoring ordinary people's concerns about immigration, crime, and cultural identity. Different enemies, same narrative. The system has been captured by elites, which no longer represent the people, and simple narratives often come with simple solutions. So if you believe that moneyed elites cause most problems, you should vote left-wing populists into power so that they can tax their wealth away. And if you believe immigration is damaging the economy and eroding local culture, you should back leaders who are not afraid to defy cultural elites and take massive actions to close the borders. Especially the right-wing populist story convinced a lot of people in the West in the last couple of decades. But okay, back to the present. Trump's remanufacturing America story is failing, Brexit is not making Britain rich, and Orban just lost in a landslide. So why again do we say right-wing populism will bounce back soon enough? Well, let's start with the economic story that should in theory empower left-wing populists, but surprisingly in reality often empowers the right. Narrative number 1. People vote populists because they are economically left behind. Okay, this map shows GDP per capita per German state, and this map shows where people mostly voted for the right-wing populist party AfD. This is not a coincidence. When we look at leaders like Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban, we see that they often struggle to gain traction in thriving, rich urban centers, but they dominate the vote in rural and declining areas. By now, it's pretty well known that the hyper-globalization period from the late 1970s to early 2000s created winners and losers. Chinese workers were able to produce for the rest of the world, massively improving their own living standards. Meanwhile, in the West, highly educated people in big cities in rich countries were also able to export services to more and more people globally, which translated into higher wages for them. But take a look at this graph. The hourly wage corrected for inflation for a US worker without higher education is very similar today to what it was in 1965. So while during the period of hyperglobalization the US economy kept growing, only the well-educated cultural and moneyed elites have actually seen their purchasing power go up, while many ordinary people were indeed left behind. It's not hard to see how this can translate into politics. If you feel the system no longer works for you and the same political elites keep defending it, of course you will start looking for alternatives, and that is exactly what we see in the data. Regions more exposed to Chinese import competition were more likely to support Brexit, Trump and the AfD in Germany. Areas more exposed to automation tend to show stronger support for populist parties. However, while this evidence looks convincing, it has 3 big problems. First, if we look at people in countries that truly lost a lot of their income between 1985 and 2015, we would expect right-wing populism to have surged in countries like Spain and Portugal. But actually, relatively fortunate and less unequal countries like Norway, Finland, Switzerland and Austria have seen far bigger right-wing populist surges. The second problem with the explanation is, once we move from regions to individuals, the story weakens. As research by political science professor Larry Bartels shows, economic disaffection turns out to be a poor predictor of whether someone votes or identifies with right-wing populism. It is far less informative than attitudes towards immigration, trust in political institutions, or broader cultural values. In other words, yes, many people in left-behind areas vote for the populist right, but if you want to actually predict whether someone will support the populist right, you get much closer by asking what they think about immigration, or whether they trust politicians, than by asking them about what they think about the economy. The third problem is, if populism is about regular working folks wanting an equal share of the economic pie, wouldn't it make sense to vote for populists who want to redistribute wealth, so those on the left? However, if we look at the data, we see the opposite. It's especially right-wing populism that is surging in the West as inequality increased. So could it be that people are fooled by the populist right to vote against their own interest? That's a story that we hear a lot. And it could be true, but actually, and it may shock some of you hearing this from me, in this case, maybe economics is not everything. So it's time for this economist here to step outside of his comfort zone with narrative number 2, right-wing populism is actually about out-of-touch cultural elites. Okay, the argument goes a little bit like this. No, voters are not confused. The real people who are confused are the cultural elites.
I really believe that Westminster, the intellectuals, the liberal elites just don't get it.
Take a simple question. Should immigrants adapt to the customs of the country that they move to? Large majorities of the public say yes. This holds all across Europe, Britain, Denmark, Germany and Sweden. But among political elites, only those in Denmark agree with that view. On the other hand, in Germany, all politicians, except for the populist right, and yes, that even includes conservative politicians, are more liberal on immigration than the average voter. Or take the question, should race be taken into account in college admissions? Only a third of Americans agree with this view. Yet mainstream Democrat leaders from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden have consistently supported race-conscious policies and criticized court rulings against them. This disconnect between what the public wants and what politicians want, on the other hand, is what political scientists call a representation gap. As you can see here in this FT graph, politicians and voters are roughly aligned when it comes to economic issues, like redistribution and capitalism. Left-wing politicians are close to left-wing voters, and right-wing politicians are close to right-wing voters. But when it comes to topics like immigration and crime, politicians are on average far more to the left than the average voter. So when the political debate is dominated by economic issues like taxes and redistribution, well, in those cases, mainstream parties are relatively safe because they champion what voters actually want. But when cultural issues move to the center of the debate, the dynamics change. If voters feel that their basic cultural preferences are ignored, or even worse, dismissed or talked down upon, that gap becomes a big opportunity for right-wing populists to emerge. The clearest example of this is the 2015 European refugee crisis. As images of large numbers of asylum seekers and irregular border crossings dominated the news, immigration shot up the list of public concerns. People did not necessarily purely react to immigration itself, but they did react strongly to the perception of chaos and loss of control. And when that perception takes hold and politicians are not reacting to it, then right-wing populists gain a big advantage. Research by James Dennison and André Freire Guedes shows that as immigration becomes more salient, support for populist right-wing parties rises right along with it. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but consistently enough to matter.
At the same time as citizens were like, oh my goodness, look at what's going on here. Our societies are changing dramatically. We're in the midst of this economic stagnation where, I feel like I have to compete for jobs. I have to compete for public goods. And at the same time, traditional establishment parties are inviting in tons of immigrants, allowing huge asylum flows, telling me that if I worry about this or I'm concerned about this, I'm a racist or a xenophobe.
So interestingly, when populist right-wingers say that cultural elites like mainstream politicians are out of touch, data shows us that they are correct. Not when it comes to economics, but when it comes to social issues like immigration and crime, yes, the general public is significantly to the right of most politicians. But as we've seen, there's only one exception. In Denmark, the Social Democrats adopted stricter immigration policies themselves, which coincided with a decline in support for the populist right from over 20% to just below 10%. But, okay, that's still 10%. So there must be more going on, but this was still a crucial story. In many left-wing circles, though, the diagnosis is very different. The problem, they argue, goes far beyond out-of-touch elites. No, it points to the people. Narrative number 3, people are simply becoming more racist. And honestly, this is not super popular in academic circles, this explanation. It's actually an argument that I often hear from friends, so I thought it was important to address it here nonetheless. Many of them watch extreme takes from populist right-wingers and their supporters. They scroll through online comment sections and come away thinking something genuinely dark is happening. People are becoming evil. People are stigmatizing entire Muslim communities as violent. Politicians are showing authoritarian tendencies. There are conspiracies about Brussels bureaucrats or George Soros erasing Western civilization. It can feel like people are forgetting the lessons of the past, growing tired of democracy and becoming more xenophobic and conspiratorial. But is it actually true? Are people really becoming less satisfied with democracy and more hostile to immigrants? Well, according to political scientist Larry Bartels, the answer to that question is clear. No, absolutely not. Based on survey responses from more than 300,000 Europeans, he finds that they have not become significantly more illiberal or more hostile to immigration over the past 2 decades. In fact, support for European integration has remained fairly stable throughout the 21st century. Level of trust in parliaments and politicians, satisfaction with democracy, and even attitudes towards immigration They have remained broadly stable over time and have even improved a little. Of course, there are some exceptions. For example, Spanish citizens became much more hostile to democracy after the massive economic crisis in 2008. However, satisfaction with democracy has been rising in Finland, Sweden and Denmark at a time when the populist right became a major player in those countries. So overall, no, it does not appear that people are becoming more racist or authoritarian, but I do understand why more and more people feel this way. The YouTube Shorts algorithm sometimes recommends me these nice videos of how US presidents used to interact with each other.
I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
I agree with Senator Kennedy.
And if we compare that to some of the stuff that Trump says these days...
Sleepy, crooked Joe Biden. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Then it's clear that something has changed. The public is willing to accept far more uncivilized language. And actually, this is not just an American phenomenon. Right-wing populist leaders everywhere use increasingly inflammatory language. So why does the public increasingly accept that type of behavior if they themselves did not become more authoritarian? Well, this brings us to narrative number 4. Blame social media. Social media is polarizing us. And there's really good evidence that this is actually happening in 2 ways. First, as you can see here, traditional media like newspapers and radio, well, they gave a voice to everyone, the hard left, the moderates and the hard right. However, as you can see here, cable TV is already quite a bit more biased towards both extremes. And on social media, well, oh boy, the algorithms really love to serve us both hard left and hard right content, while the moderate, nuanced, more boring voices are buried in the algorithms. To explain this, psychologist J. van Bavel describes 4 dark laws that drive online engagement: negativity, extremism, us versus them thinking, and moral emotional language. In other words, content that is more negative, more extreme, more tribal and more emotionally charged is more likely to grab attention and spread. This means that expressing outrage, attacking the other side, or using words like disgusting or unjust, or just super simple narratives will consistently outperform more balanced or nuanced views. So if you are on social media a lot, it makes sense that you will start believing that people are angrier, more polarized and more extreme than that they actually are. But it gets worse. The second way that social media is polarizing us, other than amplifying extreme voices, is by connecting extreme voices. You see, views that were once socially taboo, like
I could have done things to her that would have made your head spin,
used to remain on the fringes. But nowadays, people holding these views can find each other instantly. When they realize that they're not alone, then they become more confident to express those views in public. So the internet did not necessarily create these attitudes, but it did make them more visible, more organized, and more politically relevant. And this can explain why many of my friends that spend a lot of time online feel that people on average have become more extreme, even though research shows us that they did not. However, again, this is not the full story. You see, cable TV and social media spread pretty evenly worldwide, yet right-wing populism patterns vary drastically across countries. Not every country has ended up with American-style media polarization. So this brings us to our conclusion. Which narrative is the most convincing? Well, one thing is clear, it's not narrative number 3. People are not becoming more racist or authoritarian over time. Anti-democratic and anti-immigration sentiment did not just appear out of nowhere in the last decades. There's always been a slice of the population that feels this way, which means there's always been some baseline demand for right-wing populism. But for the other narratives, given that country trajectories are so different, the different right-wing populist surges can probably best be explained by combining these 3 other narratives. First, there was rising inequality, austerity, the fallout from the financial crisis. All of that shook people's trust in institutions. This could explain populist surges in the American Midwest or Eastern Europe. On the other hand, populist surges in relatively equal countries like Norway and Denmark probably have more to do with a political disconnect on cultural issues. And finally, the rise of social media and cable TV probably acted like an amplifier, giving populist parties that represent 10 to 30% of the population the power to take over several countries. So yeah, all of these three explanations are supported by the evidence. On their own though, there are too many contradictions to believe them, but taken together, it becomes clear that right-wing populism will likely surge back again and again as long as inequality remains high, politicians do not listen to voter preferences on culture and immigration, and number 3, as long as social media gives populists an algorithmic edge. But yeah, that's my take. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you find this topic as fascinating as I do, I highly recommend that you check out the excellent analysis by our advertising sponsor, The Economists, which I always check out for the research process of my videos. For this episode in particular, I learned a lot from their analysis on how the Danish Social Democrats have shifted right on immigration to counter the far right. Or, if you also care about macroeconomic stability, I encourage you to take a look at this article where they explore how efforts to be fiscally responsible and reduce budget deficits can sometimes end up benefiting populist parties. And finally, for a broader overview, I'd strongly recommend this article on what populism actually means. As these examples show, The Economist delivers insights that help you see the bigger picture and think for yourself. This is why I almost always rely on their analysis for my research, and it's why I highly recommend that you subscribe. And that's actually now more interesting than ever, given that they are offering a special 35% discount for money and macro viewers. Now, whether you prefer their daily journalism in the Economist app, or you are like me and enjoy catching up on the global economy over the weekend with a nice cup of coffee and the print edition, you'll always stay on top of the latest global developments and support journalism that values factual information, integrity, and an independent point of view. So, don't miss out. Click the link in the description or top comment below, or head over to economist.com/moneymacro to claim your exclusive 35% discount today.